And welcome to our Strategy Fabric podcast for this month. My name is Daren Fulwell. I'm Product Evangelist for IP Fabric. I'm joined today by Graham, who will be helping me break down how network assurance helps managed service providers improve the service that they offer to their customers. Graham, can you give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, certainly. Hi, everyone. So as Daren says, my name's Graham Holdsworth. I am IP Fabric's Director of Strategic Partner Development. Now, what that means is IP Fabric is typical of a youngish growing company that you go through this life cycle where your founders discover they can solve a problem. And we'll get back to that because that's very pertinent to this conversation.
Very much.
They discover they can solve a problem. You create a product, you start selling a product, you start selling that product through partners. And at some point, it reaches a stage where you bring someone in with kind of the experience that I had working with partners in different environments to mature how you work with partners and start looking at different models. Now, getting involved in the podcast today it's something I'm particularly pleased to do because from the moment I first saw IP Fabric prior to my first interview with the company, the immediate sort of flashing light in my head was, this has got managed services written all over it.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not surprised that we haven't done it up until now. It takes a leap away from that original business model. For a lot of organizations, it can involve commercial changes, product changes. For us, less so, which is good. But it's really, really good to be able to talk about this now because it feels like this is the first time we're vocalizing this publicly. But it's something that's certainly been in my head for the last 8 or 9 months. And I know, Daren, you and I have had a lot of conversations and we've started talking to some MSPs about this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I guess the beauty of where we are right now is those conversations are happening and we're speaking with all manner of different managed service providers, right? We're not just talking about the traditional internet service providers and those people who deliver connectivity, but obviously the ones that get really interested are almost the enterprise folk who are delivering management of the end-to-end networks, I suppose, for their customers. So, what kind of insights is that giving us, Graham? Where do we start?
Yes. Well, the first thing I learned is that I was ridiculously overthinking this, which frankly is not the first time in my career and life I've heard this. So started speaking to a few managed service providers with fantastic ideas for add-on services and revolutionizing the way they do business. And as soon as they saw IP Fabric, and you'll know this, you've been involved in the demos and you've lived this life in your career.
Yeah, that's true enough. The
immediate response was like, whoa. Backpedal. Let's start with the very basics. When we take on a new customer, just discovering what it is we're going to be managing is a feat in itself. And we've had responses from everything from, well, we just kind of negotiate with the customer and sign up to an agreed guess at what the network looks like, or we spend months and months and months scrabbling around the network, pulling on pieces of cable to discover how it hangs together. Now, very quickly, to go back to the founder story of the company, we were founded by 3 network consultants who were doing that very task. They had to go out and manually map a network. It was after a couple of days, presumably in a bar, I certainly would be by then, that they had surely you can automate this conversation. And, here we are 8 years later as IP Fabric doing just that. So, you have the experience in this, just discovering what it is you're taking on with a customer. How bad a task is this?
You see, this is something that you have with every network you walk into, right? And I'm sure, if there are network engineers listening to this, they will be sitting here nodding in agreement that you step into an organization where you've never seen their infrastructure before. You go to documentation. That documentation is always patchy at best, right? What you'll have is certain parts of the network where you'll have great documentation because it's maybe just been implemented, or maybe and a systems integrator has come in and built you some new stuff or whatever. But the bits over the other side where you've got at best tribal knowledge of certain aspects of what's going on, and the rest is just a mystery. These are the ones that you run into problems with straight away, because you can't get that oversight of why the network looks the way it is, because you don't even know what it looks like. And yeah, the very first step when you walk in any consultancy engagement, from my perspective, was tell me what's there. Let me see what's there. Let me get a feel for how it's put together. I'm guessing as well, from a managed service perspective, the very first thing you're trying to do is onboarding, right? Onboard that network. And without that baseline, you're not going to have a clue what that looks like.
Yeah, I was speaking with a small UK-based managed service provider who it would be great to get on one of these conversations soon. And I was saying to them, well, are the networks that you're taking on to manage, are they that poorly documented before you take them on? And his answer, which really struck a chord with me, was if they were accurately documented, they wouldn't need us.
Yeah.
If you've got that much control of your network.
From a small network perspective, absolutely. And I think this is the point, right? You've got small networks that are badly documented, and that's difficult enough. What about the big ones, right? I mean, there's you've got multiple sites connected with a WAN, you've got data centers, you've got cloud infrastructure, all of these things that you're trying to piece together. When I first started networking, it was simple, right? We had a load of machines in a room that were all cabled together, and that was your network. And we used to use here's a story, right? So we used to use 3 tools to actually deliver that management. We'd have spreadsheets, right, in order to track which ports were connected to what and which IP addresses we use and those kinds of things. We would use a diagramming tool to show us how things were connected together. And we'd use like an SNMP monitoring tool to do real simple kind of just making sure things were up, right? Today's networks, we have, as I said, we've got multiple campus environments. You've got wireless, you've got SD-WAN connecting over your internet, but also your private WAN. You've got data centers here, there, and everywhere. You've got cloud connectivity, all those things. What tools do we use, do you reckon, Graham, to manage that? Should I tell you?
Go on.
Spreadsheets to track IP addresses and ports and the like. Diagramming tools, Visio, SNMP monitoring. Same tools we used back in the 1990s on these really simple networks we're using on the complex stuff now. We cannot manage the complexity using that tooling approach. So that's why we have to look at a different and better way of doing it. How better to do that than through a managed service provider?
Yeah, and for the managed service provider, I guess it comes back to, way back in the mists of time, Henry Ford identified that if you're going to do anything at scale, it's got to be process-led, and you've got to automate everything you possibly can. It feels like it's still a very, very manual process for people. And I'm guessing it's a manual process that you're having to use very, let's be honest, expensive, well-qualified people for.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really important. That the discovery itself is not necessarily particularly difficult. It's you still got to have an understanding and whatever. And it is, you talked about the consultant going in and looking at a network for the first time. That consultant needs a certain level of network understanding in order to be able to get that view of what the network is doing. I guess this is the point at which we introduce what IP Fabric's doing here, right? Because from a network assurance perspective, what we're doing is taking that same knowledge and understanding and using it to automate the process of discovery, but then not just do it once, but do it over and over, creating these snapshots of the network so you can see how things are changing over time as well. And it's really, like you say, it's using that same knowledge and understanding, but codifying it and automating the process. That means that we discover the network in the same way that highly skilled individual would go ahead and do it. Who might be you might be better charging them out at £1,000 a day to actually go do some proper consultancy rather than the grunt work effectively of the discovery and the assessment.
And that's a very, very good point, because throughout my career, whenever I've spoke to anybody about anything automation, there are always people that will throw their hands up and kind of go, does that not mean half my workforce are going to be made redundant? Well, I think in this case, from what I'm seeing, is actually these highly qualified, highly skilled, brilliant network engineers, they love it because they can actually get on and do more interesting tasks.
Yeah, exactly. No one wants to be doing that grunt work. No one, because it is that. It's oh man, the number of times I've sat in front of a console with a pen and paper and logged into a device, found the information about that device I need, then logged into the next device and to the next one and to the next one, and had to, mate, I could tell you stories for days on that. So
if you're listening to this rather than watching, you just missed the face of a scarred man who's done this far too many times. One of the things you were saying a few minutes ago was we work on this basis of you take a snapshot of the network and that tells you what your network looks like. And you mentioned that you take snapshots and you take snapshots again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
So once you've gone beyond this, okay, initial discovery, we know what the network looks like, our customer knows what the network looks like, we're taking over management of that network now.
Yeah.
What are the benefits of just keep snapshotting over and over and over again?
Well, for one thing, having that accurate view time after time when changes are being made, right? So again, is that scarred face again? There's the if you ask network engineers about documentation, it's a necessity. It's a necessity, not even a necessity. Because of course, how can you manage an infrastructure without knowing what's there, right? But keeping it up to date is probably the biggest pain in the backside that any network engineer faces from day to day. There's the manual work that's involved in that is time consuming, right? What does the one thing that a network engineer doesn't have, especially when they're in a change window in the middle of the night, doing the work that they need to maintain the network? They don't have time. And so it always gets put to the back of the queue of things that need to be done, and very often just completely slips off the radar. So being able to automatically create something that replaces the need to document, because I wouldn't describe it as documentation. What you've got here is effectively a database. It's much more detailed than normal documentation would be. You've got that understanding of how the network hangs together, but you've also got a lot of information about the state of the network at that point in time that you wouldn't normally have in documentation. So, but you are creating this ability to have this data set that's always kept up to date, which means that then when you're doing any activity on the network, you've always got something that you can trust represents the state of the network as it was working at the point when that snapshot was created, which is invaluable. If you're making a change, you got a known good state before that change was made. You can then create another snapshot after the change and do a comparison and say, right, actually, is everything that was working before working afterwards? That kind of thing. It's a complete revelation.
Yeah. Now, I'm probably oversimplifying up to this point, because in my mind, I'm still thinking customer, managed service provider manages the customer's network. It's not that simple as networks get larger. You have different telco carriers, you have wide area network providers, you have cloud providers. I've seen it where you can have multiple managed service providers managing different bits of the network. How does IP Fabric help when you have this sort of mixed management, everyone responsible for a different bit, but they all need to play nicely together?
Well, that's a really good one. I mean, and it's not just different parts of the network, but sometimes different vendors of the network equipment, right? You might have, subject matter experts in particular vendors, environments, that kind of thing. You might have a security overlay that you need to be concerned about as well. The point with what IP Fabric's trying to achieve is an oversight of the whole thing, right? To give you the view of everything from that user who's connecting out at the wireless access point right the way through to the application workload that's sitting in the cloud and everything in between. it's where the real value comes in it. And so what we're able to do is pull together data from it, all of those environments, to give you that oversight. It can be used in all kinds of ways, but you know, let's say you want to validate that actually a service provider is giving you the service you were expecting. You know, that how do you prove that? Well, you prove that by pulling together that data with everything that's around it and making sure that all of the interactions between those different networks are as you need them to be. And I think from an MSP perspective, what that allows them to do is almost share the management of the network with whoever else, but also give them the oversight to understand how they're interacting with everyone else who supports the network.
That's got to help the I hate the term customer stickiness, but I'm going to use it anyway. That has to help with the customer stickiness. If you're the person that's providing that single source of truth or single source of observed truth that everybody is relying on, you know, you've gone from being useful to essential, which is always a good place to be.
Totally. And you know, the customer can choose to take to move from one vendor to another for a certain part of the network, or choose to go from one provider to another for a different part of the network. Doesn't matter, so long as you've got that same access to the network. IP Fabric will just read through from that and just swap out one part of the network for another. Because of the way the discovery works, we can track that change as it happens.
So I guess we've gone from, hey, you know, my conversation with the managed service provider, which was whoa, wind this back, start at the beginning. We've kind of gone through the gathering of information, so we've got a common view of what it is we're going to be managing when we take this network on. We've kind of gone through, it's a great way of kind of saving, as you say, a lot of the manual grunt work as changes are made and tracking the changes and managing multiple vendors. You're starting to talk about security and compliance and things like that. How can we help if you've got a managed service provider who's saying, well, it's great, I'm providing these managed network services. It would be great if I could do more, differentiate myself, provide additional value add services, maybe approach the market or a customer from a different way.
Yeah.
Where else can we play with this sort of?
No, I mean, this is perfect, right? So and I guess this is where IP Fabric really comes into its own, right? Because by being able to effectively replace the manual documentation process, what you've done is you've just dropped in a new level of data and insight into existing process. So the things that the service provider already does, incident management, you know, adding new capability into the network, you know, making adds, moves, changes, that kind of stuff. You've just improved those processes by simply swapping out an existing capability for an improved one. So which means there's minimal impact into the way that the service provider delivers their service, because they haven't had to change the way they actually deliver into the customer. What that then does is gives them a whole bunch of data and insight into the behavior of the network that they never had before, right? So they then, we'll talk about this in stages. You mentioned compliance there, right? There's the ability now to start measuring how closely the network matches with an intent, which of course, unless you've got some sort of automated process, you wouldn't have that capability. But by being able to do that, you can now start to do effectively audit, instead of having to do it year on year for your PCI compliance or whatever. You can do it day on day. You can understand exactly what the network's doing day to day and say, where's my, you know, where am I not compliant with either my regulatory standards or even my own operational standards? You know, where's my consistency? Being able to see that day to day means that a remediation activity might be a half-hour change rather than a 6-month remediation project. So it completely changes that understanding of what the network is doing at a point in time. But what that then leads you to is saying, well, I've got all this data, I've got all this insight, and I've got all this reporting. This is fantastic stuff. How can I now adapt the way that I deliver that service so that I'm using much more succinct processes, things that don't need human interaction now, perhaps. So you might automate the whole thing, start to look at providing more self-service, start to look at those kinds of ideas, because you have a means by which you can validate the outcome of those things across the whole network. And here's the thing, right? So a lot of people talk about network automation. They talk about network automation as being automated config change. Well, that's great. You can push a config change to a device and you can check that that change has happened. That's all you can do. With something like IP Fabric there, with a network assurance capability, what you're doing is you're looking at, has that change impacted the behavior of the network as a whole? Is that actually delivering the outcome I'm looking for? Not, is that device now configured to do the thing it needs to do? A network is a distributed system and it needs to be treated as such. And so that's where this then introduces a whole new level of capability.
So this is recognizing the difference between kind of working and working how I want it to work, which are two different things.
Completely. What do you mean by working, right? So this is where you think of traditionally what a monitoring platform does. What it will do is effectively ping a device and go, are you responding? It's not saying, is that device doing the thing I want it to do? It's literally probing at certain pieces of data and saying, does it look like it's possibly doing the thing that I want it to do? Whereas if you look at the network as a whole, you can actually identify, yes, that device as part of this particular application flow, let's say, is forwarding traffic the way I want it to, is configured correctly, is behaving the way I need it to. And that's the difference.
So there's a tremendous amount of capability there. And obviously every customer network is different. There's going to be different vendors and different providers.
Oh, yes.
If you turn around 180 degrees and look back into the managed service provider, they want it to be, quite rightly, completely the opposite. Everything standard, everything running on a standard platform, as few screens in front of every human being as possible. So there's obviously a lot of integration needed into reporting systems, network monitoring systems, ticketing, all of those things that the service provider uses to streamline their business without getting too far down the technical wormhole at this point. How easy is that done and how is it done?
Questions, as ever. Yeah, you're good at this, Graham. We should do this more.
You always kid yourself, I've done it before.
No, it's a great question. I mean, the beauty of the way that IP Fabric's been put together as a tool, it is API first, right? So and this is always, it's a bit of a cop-out answer in some ways, but we'll run with it anyway, because the idea here is that the data that sits in IP Fabric and the insight that the engine at the back end is delivering is presented through an API. The user interface for the product actually uses the API in order to get to that data. Great. But that same API is accessible externally, right? So we can build integration of that data into pretty much anything. Our solution architects are brilliant at this, because what they've done is they've created a software development kit that allows access to all of that data through using the Python programming language and using Ansible, which is a very commonly used automation tool, in order to use IP Fabric data elsewhere. We work in a lot with a lot of other people who sit in our ecosystem, in that sort of automation ecosystem, in order to build standardized approaches to integrating that data. So if you want, for example, to make sure that your ServiceNow CMDB is kept up to date, or your Netbox implementation, if you're doing automation, if you've got a ticketing platform that you want to be able to insert data from IP Fabric, it's relatively straightforward to then take API calls to retrieve the data from IP Fabric and insert it into the places where it needs to go.
relatively straightforward, says the very highly skilled and qualified network engineer.
You bet.
So kind of pulling this together, because I'm aware we've gone from, hey, can we work with managed service providers, right through to the art of the possible, doing everything. I think it's fair to say that, we are talking about evolution rather than revolution. So, I think if you were to look at this step by step, it would follow that, well, start by just automating the manual tasks that you are doing already. Don't try and boil the ocean. Don't completely rework the way you run your business, write your processes. Just start with accurately discovering networks automatically, rather than sending expensive, frankly, bored engineers out there to go and do something more enjoyable. And from there, you can start to develop the additional services, the additional capabilities that you need around it.
Exactly that. Yeah. I mean, we all, as operational folk, we all go through a process where we have to do grunt work in order to deliver an outcome. So eliminate the grunt work where you can. Still retain the same approach, but just take out those elements that are causing you pain. But then once you've got to that stage, that's when the door opens fully, because you can see then, here's all this data, here's all this insight that you can build new capability on.
One of the things I love about doing this job, and particularly with a product like IP Fabric, is every time I speak to a service provider, there's always something that they will throw in that they want to do that you kind of go, actually, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
And generally we can, where we are API first, and there is a lot of flexibility. And it's true, once you've got that network data, what you choose to use it for and how you choose to use it is really incredibly flexible.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the strength lies.
Yeah, and I suppose from that point of view, it's not just the network operations team then that can use that data, and you realize just how widely disseminated that data can be, and how many people it can actually help. We've got that. There's a great use case where we were bought by a particular organization to audit the network in terms of looking at support contracts, right? So to help procurement effectively, looking at getting an accurate view of inventory, so they could be sure that they weren't being stiffed on support contracts. There's a whole range of different ways you can use that data.
And as you know, I'm gonna share this story. We were visiting a managed service provider a couple of weeks ago, and one of their engineers walked in the room and sort of pointed to it. "You guys are IP Fabric, aren't you?" And we said, "Yeah." Anyway, "Oh, you've changed my life. I love you." Like we were long lost brothers. It was fantastic. So
it gets you right in the feels, that one.
It does. It kind of makes it all worthwhile. As you know, we can talk about this stuff all day.
True enough.
I think probably a good point to think about, just summarizing kind of where we are, where we're going. And I think a lot of that is, we are still discovering how far we can go with managed service provision and delivery of consulting services using IP Fabric as a tool rather than a product to sell to the customer. And we're still learning this with every meeting and every conversation we have with service providers. I think that this podcast today is very much the start of a conversation.
Exactly.
It will be great to involve some of the service providers we're working with to get their input on where managed service provision is going. So, we can use that as part of our thought and development cycle going forwards. It's exciting. It's truly exciting to see this stuff being used in anger.
Totally. As you said before, I mean, to actually sit and have the conversations with people and have your own eyes opened. I mean, hey, look, we've been working in this industry long enough to see what this means to people. But I mean, the amount of time and energy I personally have had to expend in actually delivering these kinds of services, this would have revolutionized and changed the way that I approached what I did day in, day out. So to be able to give people that opportunity and to see what they make of it, is like you say, super exciting, because it's not just about us. This is a conversation that will bring our experience, but it's as much about the service providers themselves, having their understanding, their perspective as to what they believe that we can bring, and then working with them on developing the product if needs be into a certain direction to move things along. This is this is all part of a trajectory, right? We're trying to get to a place where we can make things easier for everybody.
Definitely, which feels like kind of a nice point to wrap it up for today. Obviously, if anything in this conversation has piqued your interest, you want to continue the conversation just with us, feel free to reach out. You can reach us through the website, the usual methods of getting hold of people. Yep. It would be great to have the conversation and continue the conversation. Like I say, we learn more every time, which is fantastic.
No, looking forward to hearing some feedback.
Daren, thank you very much for your knowledge, experience, and expertise in this.
Pleasure, my friend, as always.
Thank you.